Hello, and welcome. If you're listening to this in the quiet of the evening, or perhaps as you're settling into rest, I want you to take a moment. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift. Let the noise of the world outside fade into a soft, distant hum. Our goal here isn't to analyse the news, but to drift to wonder and to find a little clarity in the static. Tonight we're going to talk about a story. It's a story about the stars, yes, but it's also a story about the silences here on Earth. It's about a traveller from deep space, an object designated 3I Atlas. But more than that, it's about the 4-month-long whisper that preceded the roar. For nearly 4 months, this object, this visitor, was just there. It had been detected, astronomers were looking at it, data was accumulating. But for you, for me, for the world at large, there was nothing, a void. The great mechanisms of our public awareness, the institutions we have long turned to for the what's happening of the world were curiously still. The New York Times, CNN, the major networks, they are built to tell us minute by minute what matters. And yet on this they were silent. It wasn't as serious, it was simply unselected. It hadn't been chosen for the front page, it hadn't been deemed worthy of a panel discussion. In the busy, chaotic newsroom of the world, 3I Atlas was just another piece of data filed away under Science Miscellaneous. It was perhaps considered too complex, too ambiguous, or simply not urgent enough. When it was mentioned, if at all, it was in the deep recesses of a science section categorised as just another comet. A curiosity for specialists, but not a story for the public. It was a perfect example of a tree falling in a forest with no one around to hear it. The data existed, but the story did not. And so we lived our lives unaware of this strange traveller moving through our cosmic backyard. For 4 months there was a wall of silence. Not a malicious wall perhaps, but a high one built of editorial decisions, priority lists, and the simple assumption of what we the public would find interesting. Then on October 28th something happened. The wall didn't just get a crack, it was bypassed entirely. The conversation didn't start from a polished news desk with perfect lighting. It started in a long-form podcast, a format built on deep meandering conversation. Avi Loeb, an astronomer from Harvard, sat down with Joe Rogan. It wasn't a press release, it wasn't a vetted soundbite, it was a human conversation. And in that conversation, Loeb didn't just share the data, he shared his curiosity. He shared his questions. He gave millions of people permission to wonder, wait, what is that? This one conversation flowing through earbuds and car stereos did what 4 months of institutional silence could not. It lit a fuse. It wasn't just that he presented facts, it was that he presented the mystery. He suggested that the just another comet label might not fit and that the anomalies, the strangeness of 3I Atlas were worth our full attention. The story exploded. It was a chain reaction, and it was fascinating to watch, because it revealed how information truly moves in our modern world. The gatekeepers had been asleep at the post and the public simply walked right past them. Suddenly the topic was everywhere. It wasn't just science forums. The catalyst was so powerful that it breached the highest walls of pop culture. Kim Kardashian, a person who commands the attention of hundreds of millions, posted a simple question: what is going on? She was asking for answers. When a cultural figure of that magnitude turns their attention to something, it ceases to be a niche topic, it becomes a global event. And that is when the original gatekeepers, the mainstream institutions, scrambled to catch up. The most telling sign was in the digital ink of the New York Times. You could almost see the editorial whiplash. Headlines that had previously been non-existent or dismissive, perhaps a small piece titled "Astronomers Track New Comet," were suddenly frantically rewritten. Now the front page was different. The new headlines were filled with urgency and enigma. The Atlas Enigma scientists baffled by interstellar visitor. A new mystery in the sky. What is 3I Atlas? It was a profound reversal. The media was no longer leading the public conversation. It was following it. The narrative had been set not by an editorial board, but by a podcaster, a Harvard professor, and a reality TV star. The public was now demanding the story that had been sitting on the shelf for 4 months. So what are we really talking about tonight as we settle into this quiet space? This isn't just about a comet, it's not even really about Avi Loeb or Joe Rogan. It's about the space between what happens and what we are told has happened. It's about the gap, a 4-month-long gap between raw data and the news that finally reaches your screen. This story is a perfect little microcosm of information itself. It shows us that the news is not a mirror reflecting the world. It is a curated gallery. Someone decides which pictures to hang on the wall, which ones to put in the basement, and what to write on the little plaque beneath them. For 4 months, 3I Atlas was in the basement. What this entire episode revealed with beautiful and unsettling clarity is that the old structures of information control are faltering. The power to decide what matters is no longer consolidated in a few buildings in New York and Atlanta. It's decentralized, chaotic, and flowing through new channels that can be by turns brilliant, noisy, and unpredictable. This isn't about whether the media is good or bad. It's about observing, as we do with the stars, a complex system in motion. We are seeing a fundamental shift in who gets to tell the story. And as you get ready to drift off, I want to leave you with that thought. It's a question really, and it's one I genuinely love for you to consider. In this new world with so many voices, so many signals, and so many silences, where do you place your trust when you try to understand something as vast as the universe or as immediate as your own world? Where do you turn for the story? How do you feel about that gap, that space between the event and the report? Let me know what you think if you feel like sharing. For now, let that question rest. Let the story of Three-Eye Atlas be a reminder that there is always more happening than we are told. There is the data and then there is the story. And sometimes the most interesting part is watching the world fight over which is which. But the discovery the moment that should have changed everything landed with a strange and profound silence. When the news first broke in July, it wasn't a global headline. It wasn't the lead story and it didn't stop the world. It was what journalists call buried. If you happened to be reading a major physical newspaper that day, you might have found it on page A17, a small column of text tucked between a weather chart and a local interest story. On the evening news, it was a kicker, a 90-second curiosity piece just before the final commercial break. Scientists spot another visitor from deep space. The anchor might have said with a professional smile, "This one named Three-Eye Atlas, now over to sports, over to," and that was it. The world was informed technically, but not really. The information was delivered, but the meaning was not. The message was sent, but the gravity, the sheer scale of the discovery was lost in the noise of 1,000 other less important things. This is where we must be careful. When we look back at these 4 months from July to October, it is tempting to imagine a secret room, a hidden group of people deciding to hide the truth. We imagine a conspiracy, but the reality is often more subtle, and perhaps more troubling. It wasn't a coordinated top-down plan. Instead, it was what we might call a convergent institutional culture. It was an unspoken collective agreement on what is safe to report. In newsrooms in scientific institutions, there is a shared understanding of what makes a serious story and what constitutes fringe. An object from another star is interesting, yes, but the implications, the truly bizarre data that was already streaming in, that was not safe. It didn't fit the established narrative. It was easier and institutionally safer to treat Three-Eye Atlas as just another comet. It was an act of collective subconscious filtering. It was a consensus that protected the status quo without ever needing to send a memo. But the data was bizarre, and not everyone was silent. By August, just a few weeks after the quiet debut, dissenting voices began to publish. Professor Avi Loeb, a name familiar with challenging the consensus-published papers. They didn't appear in the major slow-moving journals at first, but on open-access servers where data and ideas could be shared quickly. His team pointed to the first red flags. The trajectory was one thing, but the behavior was another. The numbers didn't add up. The object was behaving in ways that no natural comet should. These papers were not secrets. They were available to anyone in the world who wanted to look. But in the mainstream, they were met with that same institutional silence. They were classified as speculation and therefore they were ignored. The evidence wasn't hidden by a lock, it was hidden in plain sight, dismissed by those who held the keys to the conversation. Interestingly, this silence was not universal. It seemed to be concentrated most heavily in the United States and European media. If you were reading a newspaper in India or listening to a science program in Australia, the tone was different. These outlets, perhaps with less institutional pressure or simply a different cultural perspective, were more willing to ask the big questions. The BBC, for example, ran a digital piece titled "The Lingering Questions About Our New Interstellar Visitor." They didn't claim to have answers, but they acknowledged the mystery. They platformed the very questions Loeb and others were asking. They reported on the anomalies. This created a strange parallel reality in some parts of the world. Three-Eye Atlas was a developing, fascinating mystery, while in others it was already a forgotten 90-second news brief. So why? Why the difference? It comes down to a concept called editorial gatekeeping. Every media organization, every scientific journal has a gatekeeper, an editor, a senior producer, a peer review board. Their job is not just to check facts, it's to decide what is important. It is to shape the narrative. And a story that threatens the current paradigm, the fundamental way we understand our world, is the most dangerous story of all. It's not just about asking, is this true? It's about asking, are we ready for this? A story that suggests our understanding of physics or our place in the universe might be deeply wrong is a story that generates profound discomfort. It is easier, safer, and often professionally wiser to suppress that story to label it as fringe or sensational than to face the deep uncertainty it creates. The gatekeepers did their job, but they kept the gate closed. And so during these 4 long months, an information abyss began to form. A great canyon widened between 2 separate conversations. On one side of the canyon were the independent researchers, the online forums, the open source data servers. In this space, the discussion was electric, urgent, and filled with wonder. They were talking about the impossible readings. They were talking about the chemical analysis that showed pure nickel with almost no iron, a composition that shouldn't exist in nature, not in that form. They were talking about the strange pulsed radio signals that reminded them of the famous "wow" signal from decades ago, but this time they were repeating and they were pointing right at us. They were talking about the object's massive unexplained jets of glowing green gas. On the other side of the canyon was the public. And what was the public told? That 3I Atlas was a comet. A slightly odd comet, perhaps, but just a comet. The gap between these 2 realities grew deeper every day. The most important discovery in human history was happening, but it was happening in the dark. The cover-up was complete, not because of a grand, sinister plan, but because of a million small, quiet human decisions to look the other way. The silence itself was the story, and as October arrived, that silence was about to become impossible to maintain. Into this structured world of scientific caution, a new voice entered the debate. Or perhaps it was a voice that had been speaking for years, but was now focused with unsettling clarity on this new green traveller. This voice belongs to Dr. Abraham Loeb. To understand the profound intellectual and emotional struggle that 3D Atlas represents, we must first understand the man who became its most vocal challenger. This is not a fringe figure shouting from the sidelines. For decades, Avi Loeb was the very definition of the scientific establishment. He served as the chair of Harvard University's astronomy department for nearly a decade, from 2011 to 2020. He has written over 1,000 scientific papers pioneering new fields of study exploring the very first stars in the universe, the nature of black holes, and the future of interstellar exploration. He is by any measure one of the most prolific and respected minds in astrophysics. His reputation is built on a foundation of rigorous mathematics and bold but testable ideas. He is not known for wild, baseless speculation. He is known for pushing the boundaries of what is possible based on the evidence. And it was this absolute commitment to evidence that led him into his first major public controversy back in 2018. Before 3A Atlas, there was Oumuamua. You may remember the name. Oumuamua means scout from the distant past in Hawaiian. It was the first interstellar object we had ever seen pass through our solar system. And it was strange. It was shaped perhaps like a cigar, or perhaps, as data later suggested, like a flat, thin pancake. It was spinning. And most importantly, as it moved away from the sun, it sped up. It accelerated, pushed by something other than the sun's gravity. The scientific community scrambled to find a natural explanation. Perhaps it was venting gas like a comet, creating a tiny rocket effect. But there was no coma, no tail of gas or dust. Perhaps it was a hydrogen iceberg melting in a way we couldn't see. Perhaps it was a nitrogen iceberg chipped off a distant Pluto-like planet. Loeb looked at the data and offered a different hypothesis. He suggested that the simplest explanation for an object that was flat, thin, and accelerating away from the sun due to radiation pressure was that it was a light sail, a piece of technology. The reaction from the scientific community was not just skeptical, it was hostile. He was criticized, ridiculed, and dismissed. He had broken the unspoken rule of astrophysics: you do not talk about extraterrestrial technology. It is the subject of science fiction, not serious academic discourse. To do so risks your reputation, your funding, and your career. Loeb, however, did not back down. He argued that science must be open to all possibilities and that searching for technological signatures is a valid field of inquiry. We spend billions of dollars searching for biosignatures, signs of microbial life on a Mars or in the oceans of Europa. Why, he asked, would we not also search for technosignatures, the evidence of technologies created by other civilizations? He argued that sticking only to familiar explanations even when the data doesn't fit is not scientific. It is a failure of imagination. He published a book, Extraterrestrial, laying out his case not as a certainty but as a testable hypothesis. And then slowly the tide began to turn. the natural explanations for Oumuamua started to run into serious problems. The hydrogen iceberg theory was shown to be physically unstable. It would have evaporated long before it reached us. The nitrogen iceberg theory required a very specific and perhaps unlikely origin. While the mystery of Oumuamua is still not solved, Loeb's central point was validated. The object was deeply strange and conventional explanations were failing. He had successfully created a space, however small, for a serious, rigorous conversation about artificial origins. He had weathered the storm. He had shown he was willing to follow the data no matter how uncomfortable the conclusion. So when 3i Atlas appeared in 2004, Avi Loeb was ready. He had already established the framework. He had already endured the criticism. While the mainstream scientific community was grappling with the paradoxes of 3i Atlas, the impossible orbit, the nickel signature, the lack of water, the massive jets, Loeb and his team at the Galileo project began their own analysis. This time he did not hold a major press conference. He did not immediately go to the major newspapers. Instead, he began to work quietly, systematically, and in public view. He used his personal blog, a platform on the website Medium, to publish his findings. One by one, 6 papers appeared. They were not sensational, they were cautious, mathematical, and data-driven. In one paper, he analysed the chemical composition, noting that the extreme abundance of nickel and the near-total absence of carbon and oxygen were inconsistent with any known comet or asteroid. In another, he calculated the object's trajectory, confirming its interstellar origin and its impossible capture by Jupiter. In another, he modelled the intense green glow, suggesting it was not from dicarbon, which requires carbon, but perhaps from ionized superheated nickel metal. With each post he built the case brick by brick. He was not saying it is aliens. He was saying, here is the data. The data does not fit any natural object we have ever seen or theorized, and this time the reaction from the mainstream was different. After the Oumuamua backlash, attacking Loeb directly was difficult. His credentials were too strong, his math was too solid. So instead of attack, the strategy seemed to be silence. This was a kind of soft censorship. The major news outlets, the large scientific journals, the institutional press offices, they simply ignored it. 3i Atlas was the most profound astronomical mystery in a generation, and one of the world's most prominent astrophysicists was publishing paper after paper analysing it. Yet for months, there was a strange, pervasive quiet. The implications were too profound. The data was too strange. It was easier to look away. It was easier to focus on other things to hope the problem would resolve itself, that a simple natural explanation would appear. But the data kept coming. The green jets, the nickel, the orbit. The paradoxes only deepened. The silence became harder to maintain. The elephant in the cosmos was growing larger, and Loeb was the only one pointing at it. For an idea to be truly tested, it must escape the confines of the academic echo chamber. It must enter the public square. The soft censorship could only work if the conversation remained siloed. But in the modern world, there are platforms that exist outside the traditional gatekeepers. In early 2025, the dam broke. Dr. Abraham Loeb was invited onto the Joe Rogan Experience. It is by audience the largest podcast platform on Earth, with tens of millions of listeners. It is a long-form, uncontrolled, unedited conversation. It was a forum that could not be ignored, pressured, or censored. The quiet, systematic analysis that Loeb had been building for months was about to be broadcast to the entire world. The time for silence was over. The challenger had taken center stage. Here is the continuation of the text. The puzzle of 3i Atlas is not about one single strange detail. If it were just one thing, science could likely explain it. It would be a statistical outlier, a curiosity, and we would move on. The problem, however, is that Atlas presents us with a chain of oddities. There are at least 7 distinct facts about this object that, when taken together, paint a picture that is difficult to explain with our current understanding of the cosmos. Each of these anomalies by itself is highly unlikely. When we find all 7 of them in a single object, the challenge to a natural explanation becomes profound. It is this collection of improbable facts that forces us to pause and consider all possibilities. Let's look at this evidence piece by piece. First, let's consider its path. Our solar system is almost perfectly flat. The planets from Mercury to Neptune all orbit the Sun on a thin disk. We call this the ecliptic plane. Objects that formed with our solar system, like our local asteroids and comets, tend to travel along this same plane. But an interstellar visitor should be different. It is coming from the deep 3-dimensional void of space. It should arrive from a random direction, perhaps high above our system, or from far below, or at a steep angle. The statistical chance of an interstellar object arriving and just happening to be perfectly aligned with our system's flat disk is incredibly low, estimated to be about 1 in 500. Yet 3I Atlas travelled almost perfectly along our ecliptic plane, just like a local object would. This is our first major coincidence. Second, and perhaps the most startling anomaly, was the signal. As Atlas neared our planet, radio telescopes monitoring it detected a faint narrowband emission coming from its direct vicinity. The frequency was measured at exactly 1.665 GHz. For scientists involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, this number is significant. It is almost exactly the frequency of hydroxyl OH, a key component of water. This part of the radio spectrum is often called the waterhole, a quiet, logical place where a technological civilization might choose to broadcast like a cosmic meeting point. Decades ago, the famous WOW signal, a powerful and unexplained radio burst from 1977, was also detected near this very frequency. Finding a natural comet that is somehow broadcasting a clean narrowband signal at this specific frequency is without any scientific precedent. Third, we analyse what Atlas is made of. We use a method called spectroscopy, which breaks down the light reflecting from an object to see its chemical fingerprints. The results were baffling. The data showed strong signatures of nickel. This by itself is not impossible, but in nature, wherever we find nickel, we always find iron. The two metals are forged together in the hearts of dying stars and are cosmic cousins. You simply do not find one without the other in natural meteorites or asteroids. Yet the data from Atlas was clear. It contained significant amounts of processed pure nickel with almost no trace of iron. This specific composition has never been seen in any natural comet or asteroid we have ever studied. Fourth is the mystery of its appearance or lack thereof. Atlas flew very close to our Sun. At that distance, any normal comet, which is essentially a ball of ice and dust, should react violently. The Sun's intense heat and radiation should cause the ices like water, carbon dioxide or nitrogen to sublimate or boil off directly into space. This outgassing is what creates a comet's beautiful glowing atmosphere, its coma and its long sweeping tail. But as astronomers watched Atlas round the Sun, they saw nothing. It produced no tail, it showed no significant outgassing. It remained a simple inert point of light, behaving like a solid dead rock, not a volatile ice ball. This leads directly to the fifth and most famous anomaly. Even though Atlas was not producing a visible tail from outgassing, it was changing its speed. As it moved away from the Sun, precise measurements showed it was not following the path that gravity alone dictated. It was accelerating, moving slightly faster than it should have, as if a small invisible engine were pushing it from behind. This is called non-gravitational acceleration. In a normal comet, this is easy to explain. The outgassing of ices acts like a tiny rocket pushing the comet. But Atlas had no outgassing. This left us with a deep paradox, an object that was clearly being pushed by a force other than gravity, but with no visible engine or cometary jet to explain the push. The sixth anomaly is about how it spins. Most small objects in space, like asteroids and comets, do not have a simple stable rotation. After billions of years of being hit by micrometeorites and pushed around by solar radiation, they tumble chaotically. It is very rare for a small irregular object to have a clean, stable principal axis rotation like a well-spun top. Yet when we measured the rhythm of the light reflecting from 3I Atlas, we found a clean, regular and stable pattern. It completed one full rotation every 16.2 hours. This stability is more characteristic of a solid, structurally sound and balanced object, rather than a loose tumbling pile of rubble or an irregular ice chunk, which is what we expect most comets to be. Finally, the seventh anomaly is a simple matter of timing. Space is vast and our surveys to the end of the sky, while powerful, are still limited. We find objects like this by pure chance scanning the right patch of sky at the right moment. 3I Atlas was discovered just 6 months before its perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun. This is a remarkably short window. It implies the object was either very dark or it approached us in a way that was difficult to see until the last moment, like its convenient alignment with the ecliptic plane. This timing gave humanity just enough time to notice it, study its bizarre properties and witness its acceleration, but not nearly enough time to, for example, organise a mission to intercept it. So we are left with this collection of puzzles: a 1 in 500 orbit, a radio signal on the waterhole frequency, a composition of pure nickel without iron, a lack of a tail despite being near the Sun, an acceleration force with no visible source, a stable non-chaotic spin, and a perfectly timed arrival. There is a principle in science called Occam's razor. It states that the simplest explanation, the one that requires the fewest new assumptions, is usually the correct one. To explain 3i Atlas as a natural object, we must invent new complex and unobserved theories for each of these 7 points. We must assume a 1 in 500 orbit happened by pure chance. We must assume a new unknown natural process that creates a narrowband radio signal at 1.665 GHz. We must theorize a new way to form pure nickel in space without iron. We must accept that an object can accelerate without outgassing. The alternative explanation is that it was not natural. In this strange case, the razor cuts in an unexpected direction. The idea of a natural origin requires us to accept at least 7 separate, highly improbable coincidences, all happening at the same time. For many, the simpler explanation, the one that requires fewer new assumptions, is that 3i Atlas was an artifact. A piece of technology designed stable and quiet, sent by an intelligence we do not yet understand. The quiet, skeptical hum of the scientific community was about to be drowned out by the roar of the entire world. The flashpoint, the moment the match met the gasoline, began on October the 28th. It happened on a podcast. But this wasn't a small niche astronomy show. It was a history podcast, one of the largest platforms on the planet, with a known audience of over 50 million listeners. The episode was a shocking, unprecedented move. It was 3 hours long, completely unedited. It wasn't a summary or a discussion. It was quite literally a public presentation of the raw data. For 3 hours, the world listened to the unfiltered telemetry from the observatories. They heard the scientists, their voices still thick with discovery and disbelief, walking the host through the graphs. They explained the light curve anomalies, the sudden impossible brightening. They discussed the spectra, the bright green glow that defied any known natural explanation, the sheer amount of nickel, and the absurd powerful jets firing from a body that had no visible water ice. The host, usually a calm storyteller of past events, was now a proxy for the public, asking the questions everyone was thinking. But what does this mean? This is where the second critical element of the firestorm was born. The lead scientist, Avi Loeb, was pressed on the principle of Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Isn't the alien hypothesis the most complex explanation possible? The host asked. Loeb's reply became the single most quoted audio clip of the year. He used an analogy, a simple visual story that cut through all the academic jargon. He called it the tennis ball analogy. Imagine, he said, you're walking deep in the Amazon rainforest, a place no human has ever stepped before, and on a moss-covered log you find a perfect neon yellow fuzzy tennis ball. Now, what is the simple explanation? Is it simpler to believe that a unique combination of local fungi-specific sunlight exposure and a rare moss species just happened to evolve into the shape, colour and texture of a tennis ball? Or is it simpler to assume that a human, a hiker, came by and dropped it? He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for millions of listeners. The establishment is asking you to believe in the fungus. They're inventing complex, convoluted, never-before-seen natural phenomena to explain away what we are seeing. We are simply pointing to the object and asking, what if this is just the tennis ball? What if the simple explanation is that it was made? That was it, the tennis ball in space metaphor was born. The podcast was a spark, but the tennis ball analogy was the fuel. The explosion on social media was instantaneous. It wasn't a slow build, it was a vertical spike. Within 48 hours, 3i Atlas was the #1 trending topic, globally eclipsing politics, sports and all other entertainment. It was no longer a scientific debate. It was a global phenomenon. People weren't sharing academic papers. They were sharing the tennis ball analogy. They were sharing screenshots of the green glow. They were making memes, editing 3i Atlas into movie posters and demanding answers. The object, a cold, distant traveller, had suddenly become the hottest topic on Earth. And then on October 30th, the firewall collapsed. The cultural amplifiers, the people who sit at the very top of the global attention economy, took notice. Kim Kardashian, a figure with a following larger than the population of most continents, sent a simple tweet. Okay, I'm seeing this 3 Atlas thing everywhere, so what's the T? That one question, complete with the alien emoji, was the moment the story became fully untethered from academia. It was no longer a request for data. It was a request for the gossip. The T wasn't about the ratio of nickel to iron, it was the drama. Is it aliens or are the scientists lying? What happened next was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire saga. For weeks, the scientific establishment, including NASA, had remained officially silent on the 3 Atlas anomalies. They were reviewing the data, waiting for peer review, and cautioning against speculation. They had ignored the direct professional questions from Loeb and his team, but they did not ignore Kim Kardashian. Within an hour, the official NASA account replied directly to her tweet. It was a carefully worded, slightly awkward attempt to be cool while also shutting down the speculation. High Kim 3i Atlas is certainly a fascinating object, and our scientists are studying its very unique properties. These are likely due to natural though rare chemical and geological processes. No tea here, just amazing science at work. The internet saw right through it. The scientists had been screaming into the void for weeks, presenting hard data and getting no official response. But a pop culture icon asks for the tea, and the world's most powerful space agency responds in an hour. The power dynamic was laid bare for all to see. The gatekeepers of scientific information were no longer the universities or the journals. The conversation was not being controlled by peer review, it was being controlled by global public attention, amplified by celebrity. NASA's hand had been forced not by a better scientific argument, but by a larger platform. This was the perfect intersection, a new kind of event in human history. It was a science story driven by genuinely baffling and compelling data. It was a news story full of conflict, rebellion, and high-stakes drama, the lone wolf scientist versus the slow, skeptical establishment. And it was a pop culture phenomenon, a global mystery that everyone could participate in. The world was hooked. The flashpoint had been reached, and the fire was now burning on its own, a massive, uncontrolled blaze. The story of 3i Atlas was no longer just about a rock in space. It was about us, our beliefs, our systems of knowledge, and our desperate collective need to know if we are finally not alone. And so as October turned its final page, the dam of silence broke. For weeks, the conversation about 3i Atlas had been a strange, quiet hum, confined to the digital back rooms of science. It was discussed on preprint servers, in specialized forums, and in the hushed, excited tones of graduate students. The public by and large remained unaware, but the pressure of the data, the sheer accumulating strangeness of the object was building. Then, beginning in the first week of November, the floodgates opened. It was not a trickle, it was a deluge. What we witnessed in those 7 days was a fascinating, almost frantic scramble. The mainstream media, having seemingly ignored the story, suddenly awoke to it and awoke in a panic. But it was not a panic of discovery, it was a panic of control. The object itself was secondary. The primary goal, it seemed, was to manage the public's perception of the object. The narrative had to be contained before it could shape itself. It was a classic case of inoculating the public. Before the story could become "scientists are baffled by a potentially artificial object," it had to be framed as "scientists debunk wild claims about a weird comet." The rush was on to define 3i Atlas for the public before the public or the scientists could define it for themselves. Let us look closely at the different strategies that unfolded, because they are a masterclass in how our modern world processes, or perhaps prevents the processing of profound anomaly. We can start with the most respected name, like the New York Times. Their approach was perhaps the most subtle a technique we might call meta-journalism. The Times did not splash with a headline, "What is 3i Atlas?" Instead, their articles took a step back. The framing was, "Why is everyone suddenly talking about 3i's Atlas?" This is a clever and powerful maneuver. It immediately shifts the focus from the object itself to the reaction to the object. The story is no longer about astrophysics, it's about sociology. It's not a scientific mystery, it's a cultural moment. You would see headlines like, "In an anxious time, a mysterious object captures the public's imagination." The articles would use phrases like, "People are asking," or "The internet is alight with speculation." This language allows the paper to introduce the most radical ideas, like the hypothesis that it was not natural, without ever owning them. The paper isn't making the claim, it is simply reporting that other people are making the claim. By doing this, the Times places itself above the conversation. It assumes the role of the mature intellectual observer. It interviews sociologists about why humans look for meaning in the stars. It references past panics or cultural phenomena. The effect is to gently categorize 3i Atlas. It's filed away in the public's mind not as a physical object demanding investigation, but as a psychological event. It becomes a Rorschach test, a blank screen onto which we project our hopes and fears. By analysing the phenomenon of the story, the Times successfully avoids ever having to reckon with the data of the story. The reader finishes the article feeling intelligent, having analysed the people who are panicked, without ever having to feel the panic of confronting the anomalies themselves. The story is contained. Then we had the 24-hour news networks like CNN. Their technique was different. It was not gentle observation. It was the appearance of rigorous immediate debate. Their method was manufactured balance. When you turned on the television, you would see a panel. The screen would be divided, a host in the middle. On one side, you would have a scientist, perhaps one of the researchers who had published the anomalous data. On the other side, you would have a designated skeptic. The format itself sends a message: this is a 50-50 debate. There are two sides to this story, but pay close attention to the clock. The scientist brimming with complex data would be given 90 seconds. They would start to explain the isotopic ratios of nickel, the problem of the green glow, the missing carbon monoxide. You could see them struggling to simplify concepts that had taken them years to understand. They might say, the problem is the jets are massive, but we detect no carbon monoxide, which is what should be driving them if it were a comet. Before they could finish the thought, the host would interrupt. "Thank you, Doctor. Now let's go to our skeptic." And the skeptic, who often had a simpler, more dismissive message, would be given twice the time. They would not have to present complex data, they only had to sow doubt. They would look calmly at the camera and say, "Look, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We've seen weird comets before. These scientists are jumping to conclusions. The simplest explanation is always the best one. It's a rock, or it's ice. To say anything else is irresponsible." The host would then thank both guests for the lively debate. The viewer is left with a feeling of whiplash. The scientist presented a complicated, worrying puzzle. The skeptic presented a simple, comforting dismissal. The format of the debate, the balance given, ensured that the skeptic's dismissal felt more powerful and conclusive than the scientist's complex evidence. The anomaly was balanced into oblivion. Finally, we had outlets like Fox News, which employed a third and very different technique. We can call this the transparency problem. For these outlets, this Object 3i Atlas was in itself not the real story. The real story was the government's reaction to it. The angle was not, what is this thing? The angle was, what is the government hiding from us about this thing? This is a brilliant misdirection. It takes the profound existential anxiety that 3i Atlas was beginning to create this feeling of, are we alone? And redirects it toward a much more familiar terrestrial target, political authority. The reporting would focus on the Simultaneous from official channels. Why hasn't NASA held a press conference? What did the Space Force know, and when did they know it? The story becomes one of a potential cover-up. It becomes a political drama, not a scientific one. This strategy cleverly absorbs the public's fear and turns it into anger, a much more manageable and marketable emotion. Viewers are encouraged to be angry at the elites, who are not telling them the truth. In this narrative, 3i Atlas itself becomes almost irrelevant. It is just a prop in a story about government transparency and media bias. The cosmic implications are completely overshadowed by a familiar political fight. The public's attention is successfully diverted from the sky to the White House. These three case studies, the Times, CNN and Fox, show how different segments of the media with different audiences all arrived at the same destination. They all managed to control the story. One made it a psychological curiosity, one made it a debunked debate, and one made it a political scandal. What none of them did was simply sit with the evidence. This brings us to the playbook. These specific tactics are all part of a larger narrative control playbook that is rolled out whenever a story appears that is too large, too strange, or too disruptive to the status quo. You learn to see the warning signs. The first sign is the question headline. A headline that reads, "Is 3 Atlas an alien probe?" is not designed to explore the question. It is designed to frame the question as inherently ridiculous. The implied answer is always no. It's a way of inoculating the reader, of making them feel skeptical before they've even read the first sentence. Another tactic is false balance, which we saw with the CNN example. This is the idea that you must always give both sides equal weight, even when one side is a mountain of peer-reviewed data and the other is a simple evidence-free assertion. This creates the illusion of a debate where in reality there may not be one. Another is skeptical quoting. A journalist interviews 5 scientists. 4 of them say, "This is the strangest thing I've ever seen in my career." One of them says, "Well, we must be cautious not to jump to conclusions." Guess which quote makes it into the final article? The cautious quote is used to anchor the entire piece, making it seem as though the entire scientific community is skeptical when the opposite might be true. But of all the tactics in the playbook, the most effective, the most profound, and the one used by everyone was the core emission. This truly was the heart of the media's failure during that first week of November. No single mainstream outlet was willing to address the cumulative probability of the anomalies. They were perfectly happy to take each mystery one by one and offer a simple, isolated explanation. They would run a segment on the green glow. They would bring in an expert who would say, Yes, under very specific conditions, diatomic carbon can glow green. The host would nod and they would move on. The green glow mystery was now considered solved in the public mind. The next day, they would tackle the massive jets. They would bring in another expert who would say, it's possible that pockets of solid nitrogen heated by the sun could sublimate and create these jets. The host would thank them. That mystery was now solved. Then the nickel. A nearby supernova could have forged this specific isotope of nickel and seeded the cloud where this object formed. Solved. This is a classic divide and conquer strategy. It is like finding a man holding a winning lottery ticket and saying, well, someone has to win the lottery. It's not a big deal. But 3 Atlas was not just one winning lottery ticket. It was a man who was struck by lightning on his birthday while holding a winning lottery ticket, who also happens to be a perfect genetic match for the president, and who speaks a language no one has ever heard before. The media successfully and deliberately refused to ask the one question that mattered. What is the probability of all 7 of these anomalies happening in one single object at the same time? What are the chances of an object having the solved green glow, and the solved nitrogen jets, and the solved nickel isotope, and the solved lack of water, and the solved strange trajectory all at once? This question was the one that was never asked. Because to ask it is to admit that the simple isolated explanations are not sufficient. To ask it is to confront the terrifying, awesome possibility that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. To ask that question is to admit that the solved mysteries are not solved at all. They are just 7 different ways of saying the same thing. We have no idea what this is, and so after a frantic week of coverage, the media wave crested and broke. Having solved the mystery by breaking it into pieces and dismissing each piece, the news cycle moved on. The story was contained. A new political scandal, a celebrity, an economic report, all of it rushed in to fill the space that 3I Atlas had briefly occupied. The public was left with a vague sense of confusion, a memory of a weird comet that some people thought was aliens, but which was debunked. The great act of narrative control was complete. The world returned to normal. But the object itself, 3I Atlas, it did not care about the news cycle, it did not care about the debates or the headlines or the politics. It just kept coming. And the real science, the real mystery continued far from the television cameras. Of course, here is the continuation of your script focusing on part 6. The monologue continues in a calm, steady voice. For weeks, the story of 3I Atlas had been a quiet, growing hum. It lived in the digital spaces where scientists gather on preprint servers and in specialized forums. The data was accumulating, and with it a sense of profound, quiet tension. The public, for the most part, was unaware. But the pressure of the data, the sheer stacked strangeness of the object was building. Then in the first week of November, the dam broke. It was not a gradual leak, it was a flood. What we witnessed in those 7 days was a fascinating, almost frantic scramble. The mainstream media, having seemingly ignored the story, suddenly awoke to it. But it was not an awakening of shared discovery, it was an exercise in control. The object itself, the physical reality of it, seemed secondary. The primary goal was to manage the public's perception of the object. The narrative had to be contained before it could define itself. The rush was on to frame 3I Atlas for the public before the public or the scientists themselves could truly begin to understand it. It was a classic case of inoculation. Before the story could become scientists are deeply baffled by a potentially artificial object, it had to be framed as scientists debunk wild claims about a weird comet. Let us look closely at the different strategies that unfolded. It is a quiet, powerful lesson in how our modern world processes or perhaps prevents the processing of a profound anomaly. We can start with the most respected names publications like the New York Times. Their approach was perhaps the most subtle a technique we could call meta-journalism. The Times did not lead with the raw facts. Their articles took a step back. The framing was not, "What is 3I Atlas?" Instead it was, "Why is everyone suddenly talking about 3I Atlas?" This is a very clever and very effective maneuver. It immediately shifts the focus from the object itself to the reaction to the object. The story is no longer about astrophysics, it's about sociology. It is not a scientific mystery, but a cultural moment. You would see headlines like, "In an anxious time, a mysterious object captures the public imagination." The articles would use phrases like, "People are asking," or "The internet is alight with speculation." This language allows the paper to introduce the most radical ideas, like the hypothesis that it was not natural, without ever owning those ideas. The paper isn't making the claim, it is simply reporting that other people are making the claim. By doing this, the newspaper places itself above the conversation. It assumes the role of the mature intellectual observer. It interviews sociologists about why humans look for meaning in the stars. It might reference past cultural panics or our collective fascination with the other. The effect is to gently categorize 3i Atlas. It gets filed away in the public's mind, not as a physical object demanding urgent investigation, but as a psychological event. It becomes a Rorschach test, a blank screen onto which we project our own hopes and fears. By analysing the phenomenon of the story, the newspaper successfully avoids ever having to reckon with the data of the story. The reader finishes the article feeling intelligent, having analysed the people who are panicked, without ever having to feel the core anxiety of confronting the anomalies themselves. The story is contained. Then we had the 24-hour news networks like CNN. Their technique was different. It was not gentle academic observation, it was the appearance of rigorous immediate debate. Their method was manufactured balance. When you turned on the television, you would see a host in the centre of the screen. On one side you would have a scientist, perhaps one of the researchers who had actually published the anomalous data. On the other side you would have a designated professional skeptic. The format itself sends a message: this is a 50-50 debate. There are two sides to this story and they are equal. But if you watched closely, you would notice the clock. The scientist, who was filled with complex, troubling data, would be given 90 seconds. They would start to explain the isotopic ratios of nickel, the problem of the green glow, the missing carbon monoxide. You could see them struggling, trying to compress concepts that had taken them years to understand into a tiny soundbite. They might get as far as, the problem is the jets are massive, but we detect no carbon monoxide, which is what should be driving them if it were a comet. And before they could finish the thought, the host would interrupt. Thank you, Doctor, a fascinating point. Now let's go to our skeptic. The skeptic, who often had a much simpler, more dismissive message, would then be given twice the time. They would not be burdened with presenting complex data, they only had to sow doubt. They would look calmly at the camera and say, look, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We've seen strange comets before. These scientists are jumping to conclusions. The simplest explanation is almost always the correct one. It's a rock, or it's ice. To say anything else to frighten the public is frankly irresponsible. The host would then thank both guests for the lively debate. The viewer is left with a feeling of whiplash. The scientist presented a complicated, worrying puzzle. The skeptic presented a simple, comforting dismissal. The format of the debate, the balance given, and the fact that the skeptic always got the last word in assured that the skeptic's dismissal felt more powerful and conclusive than the scientist's complex evidence. The anomaly was balanced into oblivion. Finally, we had outlets like Fox News, which employed a third and very different technique. We can call this the transparency problem. For these outlets, the Object 3 Atlas was in itself not the real story. The real story was the government's reaction to it. The angle was not, what is this thing? The angle was, what is the government hiding from us about this thing? This is a brilliant misdirection. It takes the profound existential anxiety that 3i Atlas was beginning to create this deep cosmic feeling of, are we alone? And it redirects that anxiety toward a much more familiar terrestrial target political authority. The reporting would focus entirely on the silence from official channels. Why hasn't NASA held a press conference? What did the Space Force know and when did they know it? Why are they hiding the D? The story instantly becomes one of a potential cover-up, becomes a political drama, not a scientific one. This strategy cleverly absorbs the public's fear and turns it into anger, a much more manageable and marketable emotion. Viewers are encouraged to be angry at the elites or the swamp for not telling them the truth. In this narrative, 3i Atlas itself becomes almost irrelevant. It is just a prop in a familiar story about government transparency and media bias. The cosmic implications are completely overshadowed by a familiar political fight. The public's attention is successfully diverted from the sky above to the political battles here on the ground. These three case studies, the Times, CNN and Fox, show how different segments of the media, all serving different audiences, arrived at the same destination. They all managed to control the story. One made it a psychological curiosity, one made it a debunked debate, and one made it a political scandal. What none of them did was simply sit with the evidence. These specific tactics are all part of a larger narrative control playbook that is rolled out whenever a story appears that is too large, too strange, or too disruptive to the status quo. You learn to see the warning signs. The first sign is the question headline. A headline that reads, "Is 3i Atlas an alien probe?" is not designed to seriously explore that question. It is designed to frame the question as inherently ridiculous. The implied answer is always no. It's a way of inoculating the reader, of making them feel skeptical and superior before they've even read the first sentence. Another tactic is skeptical quoting. A journalist interviews 5 scientists about 3i Atlas. 4 of them say, "This is the strangest thing I've ever seen in my career. The data does not make sense." The 5th scientist says, "Well, we must be cautious not to jump to conclusions. Nature is full of surprises." Guess which quote makes it into the final article? The cautious quote is used to anchor the entire piece, making it seem as though the entire scientific community is skeptical, when in fact the opposite might be true. But of all the tactics in the playbook, the most effective, the most profound, and the one used by everyone was the core emission. This truly was the heart of the media's failure during that first week of November. No single mainstream outlet was willing to address the cumulative probability of the anomalies. They were perfectly happy to take each mystery one by one and offer a simple, isolated explanation. They would run a segment on the strange green glow. They would bring in an expert who would say, "Ah yes, under very specific rare conditions, diatomic carbon can glow green." The host would nod and they would move on. The green glow mystery was now considered solved in the public mind. The next day they would tackle the massive jets that had no water vapour. They would bring in another expert who would say, "It's possible that pockets of solid nitrogen heated by the sun could sublimate and create these jets even without carbon monoxide." The host would thank them. That mystery was now solved. Then the pure nickel. "Ah, a nearby supernova long ago could have forged this specific isotope of nickel and seeded the cloud where this object formed." Solved. This is a classic divide and conquer strategy. It is like finding a person who was struck by lightning. You can say, well, people get struck by lightning, it's rare, but it happens. But 3i Atlas was not just a person struck by lightning. It was a person who was struck by lightning on their birthday, while simultaneously holding a winning lottery ticket, who also happens to be a perfect genetic match for the president and who speaks a language no one has ever heard before. The media successfully and deliberately refused to ask the one question that mattered. What is the probability of all 7 of these anomalies happening in one single object at the same time? What are the chances of an object having the solved green glow and the solved nitrogen jets and the solved nickel isotope and the solved lack of water and the solved strange trajectory all at once? This question was the one that was never asked. Because to ask it is to admit that the simple isolated explanations are not sufficient. To ask it is to confront the awesome and perhaps terrifying possibility that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. To ask that question is to admit that the solved mysteries are not solved at all. They are just 7 different ways of saying the same thing. We have no idea what this is. And so after a frantic week of coverage, the media wave crested and broke. Having the passenger by breaking it into little digestible and incorrect pieces, the news cycle moved on. The story was contained. A new political scandal, a celebrity trial, an economic report, all of it rushed in to fill the space that 3i Atlas had briefly occupied. The public was left with a vague sense of confusion, a memory of a weird comet that some people thought was aliens, but which was of course debunked. The great act of narrative control was complete. The world returned to normal. But the object itself, 3i Atlas, it did not care about the news cycle. It did not care about the debates or the headlines or the politics. It just kept coming, and the real science, the real mystery continued, far from the television cameras in the quiet labs and observatories that were still pointed fixedly at the silent traveller. When a truly disruptive idea enters the public sphere, a fascinating process begins. It is not a conspiracy, but a pattern. It is a shared, almost instinctual playbook used to cover uncomfortable truths. It is a set of linguistic and structural tools that allow a story to be told without the publisher taking on the risk of believing it. It's a way to touch the strange, to report on the anomalous, and yet to return the reader safely to the status quo by the end of the article. It is a formula for neutralization. The first and most common tool is the question headline. It is a marvel of efficiency. A headline that asks, "Is it an alien probe?" or "Did 3i Atlas send a signal?" achieves 2 goals at once. First, it seizes your attention with the most sensational possibility. Second, it plants that very idea in your mind. But because it ends with a question mark, the publication is shielded from any accusation of claiming it as fact. They are just asking. It provides perfect plausible deniability. The question mark acts as a shield. It allows the most radical concept to become the anchor for the entire story, even if the article itself spends most of its time arguing against that very possibility. The suggestion has already done its work. Once inside the article, you encounter the second technique, attribution without evaluation. You will see phrases like "the scientist claims," or "he insists," or "Loeb argues." Notice the subtle invisible distance this creates. The reporting is technically accurate, that is what the scientist said. But the verbs used, claims or argues, frame the statement as one person's specific and perhaps biased opinion. It is not presented as a finding or a discovery. The reporter is simply a messenger holding the idea at arm's length. They are not evaluating the merit of the claim itself, they are only reporting that a claim was made. This allows the radical idea to be presented, but it is safely contained, firewalled off from objective fact and attributed to a single controversial individual. This leads directly to the third and perhaps most misleading tool, the action of false balance. To appear objective and thorough, a report will include voices from both sides. But watch how they are balanced. The story might give the proponent of the new challenging idea a single paragraph, but it will then give the skeptical viewpoint the rebuttal, 2 or 3 paragraphs. It creates a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio. This performs the action of fairness, but it is not true balance. It is a structural method of signaling to the reader which side is the safer one to believe. The sheer volume given to the skepticism makes the new idea seem small and outnumbered, like a fringe concept that must be corrected by a larger, more sensible majority. While this structure is being built, the language itself is softened by a semantic hedging. These are the cautious, protective words that are sprinkled throughout the text. Possibly cause, could, might, it seems, apparent, potentially. These words are like linguistic pillows softening any direct impact. They drain the certainty from any statement. If the strange theory turns out to be wrong, the article was never definitive. It only said it could be true. If by some small chance it turns out to be right, the publication can claim they were on the story from the beginning. It sounds like careful, responsible journalism, but it is also a way to avoid taking any real stance. It leaves the reader in a fog of mere possibility, never in the clear light of assertion. When a new idea is truly challenging to the foundations of a field, the playbook calls for the appeal to experts or consensus as proof. This is a powerful shift in the argument. The report stops discussing the evidence, the strange light curve, the anomalous chemistry, the lack of a coma, and starts discussing the people. You will read sentences like, "The majority of astronomers believes," or "the broad consensus in the scientific community is." This technique uses the sheer number of people who agree as evidence of correctness. It implies that the consensus is a safe, warm, and well-lit room, while the new idea is out in the cold darkness alone. The argument is no longer about the data, it's about whether you, the reader, are willing to stand against a large group of credentialed experts. After the debate has been balanced and the consensus has been established, the article must conclude. It needs a firm, reassuring final word. This is the ending with institutional authority. The final paragraph, the last voice the reader hears, is almost always given to a major established institution. It will be a quote from NASA, a statement from the European Space Agency, or a summary from a leading traditional university. This voice will not engage with the anomaly itself. Instead, it will make a broad statement about the importance of the scientific method, the need for more data, and the high bar for new discoveries. It's a final calming voice that brings the reader back from the edge of the unknown and plants their feet firmly on the safe, solid ground of the conventional. But all of these techniques rely on the seventh and final tool, the most powerful and the most invisible of them all: selective emission. The real story is often shaped not by the words that are printed, but by the facts that are left out. A report might focus entirely on an object's strange hyperbolic orbit, but conveniently omit the data on its anomalous chemical composition. It might highlight a scientist's controversial conclusion, but omit the pages of mathematical modelling that led them to it. By choosing which data points to include and, more importantly, which to exclude, a narrative can be perfectly curated. The facts that are presented may all be true, but the picture they paint is dangerously incomplete. This isn't lying. It's the art of building a frame. It is the architecture of the story, and it's the hardest part of the playbook to see. Together, these 7 techniques form a map. They are not necessarily malicious, but they are a mechanism of control. They are the system's immune response to a foreign idea. They allow us to read not just the words on the page, but the structure of the story itself. It is the playbook for managing the uncomfortable, the anomalous, and the profound. And as we wait, as we look up at this green anomaly moving through our skies, we have to ask a difficult question. Are we being told the whole story? When something this monumental occurs, you expect a flood of information. You expect every major news channel to lead with it, every scientific journal to rush out special editions. But instead, what we are hearing from the largest platforms is a strange, persistent silence. The nightly news programs, ABC, NBC, CBS, which reach millions of homes, have offered almost no deep coverage. It is mentioned as a curiosity, a passing space rock, and then they move on. The two titans of scientific publication, the journals Nature and Science, have not published the emergency papers we would expect. This silence is heavy. It creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, unsettling details, facts, rumours, and hard questions are starting to appear. These are the things they are still not telling you. Let's start with the most speculative, but perhaps the most profound piece of buried information. There are unconfirmed whispers, I must stress. Unconfirmed, of mathematical patterns detected in the faint radio signals coming from 3i Atlas. The claim is that when analysing the background static, some analysts found a repeating signal hidden inside the noise, a signal that allegedly follows the Fibonacci sequence, that famous mathematical code that appears in nature in the spiral of a galaxy and the petals of a flower. If this were true, it would be the single greatest discovery in human history. It would be proof. But it is such an extraordinary claim, so far outside the bounds of conventional science, that no official source will even acknowledge the rumour. Is it just wishful thinking, our minds seeing a pattern in the chaos? Or is it something real? Something that is being deliberately ignored because its implications are too frightening? Let's move to something more concrete. Buried information number 2. The delayed images from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, or MRO. We have one of the most powerful cameras ever built currently orbiting Mars. This object, 3i Atlas, passed relatively close to the red planet on its way in. It is a near certainty that the MRO was pointed at the object. The data should exist. So where are the pictures? The official line is that the data is processing or delayed, but in an age of instant global communication, this delay is suspicious. These images could settle the debate. They could show us the shape. They could show us if it is a solid metallic object or a fluffy pile of rubble. The fact that this data is being withheld makes people wonder, did they see something they cannot explain? Or perhaps did they see something they can explain but do not want to? This brings us to the third and most glaring scientific contradiction of the tale that is still missing. We have just passed the critical dates of November 7th and 8th. The object has passed its perihelion, its closest, fastest and hottest point in its journey around our Sun. This was the moment of truth for the comet theory. If 3i Atlas were a dirty snowball or a chunk of ice, this is the moment the Sun's intense heat and the solar wind should be tearing it apart. We should be seeing a magnificent tail of gas and dust, the very thing that makes a comet a comet. And yet the latest observations confirm the object is still inert. It is quiet, it is not outgassing, it is not breaking apart, it remains a single solid point of light. The comet explanation is failing this test right before our eyes, yet it continues to be the only explanation offered by the media. How long can they call it a comet when it refuses to act like one? Now we must look at the context. This object is not appearing in a vacuum. Buried information number 4 is the political background. Just 2 months ago in September, the famous Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, the man who was brave enough to suggest Oumuamua might be artificial, was called to Washington, D.C. He didn't just speak to a public committee, he gave a classified briefing to the US Congress. The topic was UAP's unidentified anomalous phenomena. For the first time in history, the government is admitting under oath that there are things in our skies they cannot identify. Weeks later, the most anomalous interstellar object we have ever seen enters our solar system. To think these two events are unrelated is to ignore the reality of the situation. The world's governments were already on high alert for non-human intelligence, and then this arrived. This leads to the 5th point, the survey trajectory. When you look at the path 3i Atlas is taking, it does not look random. It is not just falling past the Sun and leaving. Its path seems exquisitely designed. It used a flyby of Mars. It is now swinging past Earth, and it is headed for a rendezvous with Jupiter. Mars, Earth, Jupiter. This is not a random path. This is what engineers call a gravity assist trajectory. It is an incredibly efficient path that a probe would use to survey the most interesting planets in our system. It is a path designed for reconnaissance using the gravity of each planet to slingshot it to the next target. It looks for all the world like a tour Finally, there is the sixth and perhaps most baffling piece of information: the lack of a major observation campaign. We have the James Webb Space Telescope, a miracle of engineering. We have massive observatories in Chile and Hawaii. This object is the single most important astronomical event of our lifetime. Why is every major telescope not dropping everything to stare at it? We are told there are scheduling conflicts. We are told the Webb telescope cannot look at it because it is too close to the sun, which could damage its sensitive optics. While that is a valid technical concern, it does not explain the silence from all other major observatories. When the neutron star merger was detected in 2017, every telescope on and off the planet turned to look. It was an all-hands-on-deck moment for astronomy. Why not now? The silence is deafening. Is it possible they are looking? Is it possible they have seen it up close and the data is so shocking, so world-changing that they have decided we are not ready to see it too? When you put these 6 pieces together, the media, silence, the rumours of mathematics, the missing Mars photos, the comet with no tail, the secret UAP briefings, the Grand Tour trajectory, and the silent telescopes, it paints a disturbing picture. It is a picture of information being managed, controlled, and curated. We are being told one story, while the facts suggest another much stranger story is happening just beyond our view. Ultimately, 3 Atlas has become more than an interstellar object. It has become a mirror, reflecting our own hopes, fears, and social status. It is a test of our entire global information ecosystem. The truth about 3 Atlas, whether comet, asteroid, or whatever, is incredibly important. It will teach us something new and wonderful about the universe. But the truth about how we find and share that information may be even more important. This event is forcing us to question how we know what we know. It is challenging our systems of authority and forcing us all to become better critical thinkers. The story is coming to an end. The answers are coming. Stay alert, sleep good,